This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to talk about voting, voter access, which is a big topic in our society right now. But instead of talking exclusively about access to voting for different groups and questions about mail-in voting and voter identification and who counts the votes, all the issues that are super important and in the news, we're also going to talk today about enfranchising younger voters. What would it mean to give younger voters in our society more say? What would it mean to give those who have more of a stake in our future more of a role in our elections? Zachary, Sam Abrams, our guest today, and I have written an article about this, and Sam and I have been working on a series of studies of young voters in our society. And we're going to talk in particular about young voters today and what role they could play if given more access to the voting booth. We're fortunate to be joined by our good friend, co-author, and leading scholar, Sam Abrams. Sam, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your interest and for having me.
Sam is a professor of politics at Sarah Lawrence College and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a prolific author on this topic and many others. Most recently, he's been writing a lot about the role of libraries in our society. I encourage all of our listeners to read his work on that topic as well. We're joined as well, of course, by Zachary Suri, who's a co-author of the most recent article that Sam and Zachary and I wrote on this topic in The Hill, called Give Young People the Vote. We will link that article to the podcast itself. Zachary, do you want to start us off, as always, with your poem?
What You Still Have Left to Give. That's what it's titled. Too many of us have watched your sterling arches bow, have heard your band playing on the tilting deck, have seen your face the way it looks to you in the mirror after a night of remembering. Is it what you've lost that haunts you? No, I can see it in your parched lips. It's what you still have left to give. Too many of us have seen that face, the furtive violence of that haggard face, with which, held high like a crest or a shield, you wander the halls in your sleep. We watch your somnambulations. We have watched you walk head first into a wall. Too many of us have seen your own regrets. We were the ones watching from the bridge as you floated by ruminating. We were the ones in the supermarket when you wept over a magazine. We were the ones holding you back when you wanted to punch a stewardess. I have seen too many of your insecurities for you to feel secure shaking my hand. Too many of us have heard the voices in your head for you to consider giving us a voice.
I love it, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about trying to encapsulate the sort of generational gap that exists between young voters and already established members of our sort of political class. And also trying to understand why it is that there's such resistance to giving young people a voice in our politics, to allowing things like social movements and enfranchisement that comes from young people to play a larger role in our society.
Yeah, I think you expressed that very well. Sam, it seems so obvious to say that young people have such a stake in our future. Why is there resistance to giving young people more of a say in our politics?
It's about power. It's about control. It's about the institutions. For better or for worse, older generations don't want to step aside. We see this if we look at who's running for office in the presidency. I mean, it was a very old set of communities. These were not even boomers. These were silent generation people. These were individuals over the age of 75. There's a lot at stake in the political game right now in terms of what issues matter, what people think about, how various resources are distributed, whether it's toward the environment, social security, healthcare, and so on. And if you have been in a position of power for decades, it's highly unlikely that you want to give it up. And I think that's just a very straightforward, simple reality that we are facing today. I want to commend Zachary on yet another phenomenal poem. I do not know how you write these things. I cannot do it, and I just shut my eyes and listen. And I think your poem shows why you should be voting and you should be engaging. I mean, your generation of people, and I'm going to talk down for a minute, which is exactly what I don't want to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to talk at you about this. Think about the sophistication of your argument you just made. It was nuanced. It referenced history. It referenced struggle. And if you look back at the past few years, folks like Zachary have not come of age in the booming 90s when I, as a bitter Gen Xer, came of age, when things were relatively easy and everything just seemed like we were floating on clouds and money was, was coming in. Folks of Zachary's age, so these are Gen Zers, folks who are in their teens and up to about 24. There's no hard cutoff point. But basically, when we survey folks who are Gen Zers, it's 18 to 24. It's very hard to survey folks younger than 18 from a legal perspective, so we usually just do 18 to 24. This group came of age in a moment of incredible polarization, incredible economic instability, incredible environmental instability, questions about security. I mean, when I grew up, I never dreamed of being attacked on the street because I'm Jewish or because I'm at a synagogue or just in my school. Today, people have to deal with active shooter drills. Zachary's generation has basically walked through fire and walked through hell and back. And they're a very impressive generation because it's, again, not just one or two or three or four networks where they get their media from. This is a group that is inundated and bombarded with stimulus or various stimuli, have media thrown at them from around the globe, literally at all times. And, this is a group that has learned how to process, how to separate the signal from the noise, how to be curious, how to question, and how to say, is this right? Is this wrong? Does this make sense? Does that make sense? They're incredibly sophisticated, incredibly worldly, incredibly connected, and should have a voice at the table. Even if they didn't up until now, it's not as if the folks who are boomers and silence have done a great job leading this country. We're incredibly polarized on an elite level. Our earth is burning. We have a lot of problems, and we need a new voice. And these Gen Zers can do it. And they're about consensus building. They're about finding practical solutions. So I'm excited about this prospect. But it's going to be a fight because the older groups have power. Why would they want to give it up?
Zachary, as you know from the comments on our article, one of the objections to what Sam said so well is, that's not correct. Some would say young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, they're just on their phones. They don't care. They don't know what life is about. Sure, they've grown up in these difficult times, as Sam describes, but some would argue you're also a spoiled generation. What's your response to that?
Well, I think it's difficult to sort of bridge those generational resentments, if you will. But I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of condescension towards new forms of media, as Sam mentioned, and new concepts of political engagement. And I think in many ways, our generation is bombarded with political messages every day, certainly, but we've also become more and more involved in political movements. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement in the past few years has become the largest social movement in American history, and it's been by and large led by young people. And same could be said for a lot of movements that deal with issues from gun violence to climate change. And so I think that, yes, young people have a different kind of political experience, but I think it's a political experience that is even more valuable today in Washington than traditional political and legislative experience.
Mm-hmm. And certainly the last few years, as Sam said, have reinforced those tendencies.
Indeed.
So Sam, why now? After World War II, the argument began to be made to give 18-year-olds the right to vote, as many people might know, until the early 1970s, until the 26th Amendment. Only 21-year-olds could vote. We moved the voting age by the early 1970s down to 18. Why now consider moving it to 16?
Well, we know that in Europe, and as we mentioned in the article, Germany, there are serious proposals to do that. I'm not familiar with a whole lot of serious proposals in the United States quite yet, but why now is very simple. We are gridlocked. We are gridlocked like nobody's business. If there is a well-organized and Gen Zers are incredibly well organized. They may not have leadership yet, and I think that's one of the big issues. It's not clear that there are certain mouthpieces, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but it's not clear that there are thought leaders or particular people who represent Gen Z quite yet. It's much more diffuse. But, there's this level of engagement that's very high. There's a level of urgency that's very high. If we don't act now, how many books in the bookstore, how many articles come out literally weekly talking about the fact that we may be headed down a totalitarian path in this country, an authoritarian path in this country, that we're not going to be able to break the gridlock. We need to do something to reestablish our values. We need to remember as a country that we are about creating consensus and trade-offs. This group understands that, and this group has now come of age and has shown its maturity, shown its ability to organize. It certainly was an active voice in 2020 and the presidential election. And like I said, I think the older generations have ceded, their absolute right and authority here by messing things up so badly. This is a way to provide, what we say in political science, an exogenous shock, an external shift that could possibly energize and shake up the parties and change the discourse. And if we don't do something quickly, I think we're headed down a very, very dangerous path in this country. I've written about polarization for years. And when my first book came out, a book almost 20 years ago, which is very weird to say that. I don't feel like I'm old enough to do that. It was called Culture War, The Myth of a Polarized America. I remember being asked, could you ever see this country turning to civil war? Do you think this country could ever turn violent? And I would chuckle and say, we're nowhere near that. 2 decades later, I'm completely wrong. My feelings about that have changed radically. And there are extremists, whether correct or not, have a disproportionate amount of power on both the left and the right. We need to do something about that. Expanding the electorate most likely will help significantly.
It's such an important point because historically, as you know so well and have written about, it's very hard to get voters above the age of 30 to change their partisan preferences. Voter change often comes from new voters entering the system, either voters who were disenfranchised and then given the right to vote, like African Americans in the years after the Civil War, before Jim Crow, or new voters coming into the electorate in the 60s and 70s in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. You see this as another moment like that, as I understand it, correct?
That is exactly right. And this group is so mobilized that we also know from our studies, and a lot of our studies have been wrong. I'm very open about that. A lot of our perceptions about the presidency and how it works have changed radically as Donald Trump took over. And a lot of the norms and institutional sort of barriers fell very quickly. But one of the studies that is fairly robust is that voting becomes habitual. So if we can engage this group soon, it becomes habit forming, and then you will have an engaged generation for a very long time. My concern is if we don't, and this power imbalance continues, this group may tune out. That's one of my big concerns. They may say it's over. What's the point? We're screwed. Sorry to say it that way, but I hear this all the time from my students and from my survey work. This is a time when we may be able to engage, 7, 8, up to 9 million new voters. It's not a huge number relative to the over 300 million we have in the country. But when you have hotly contested close races, tens of thousands of young folks in certain areas can make a very big difference. And we have to do something. And as I said before, this is a wonderful way to do that.
Yeah, you make a very important point. I think one of the things I really liked that you said is about how important it is to get young people voting. And I think we hear a lot of talk nowadays, in many ways, it comes a lot from the right, about civic education and the necessity of people understanding what America is about, what America stands for. And I think there's no better way to do that than to allow young people to have a voice and to allow people to vote. Young people, there's no better civic education in my mind for a young person than voting and having to pick from a list of candidates that they've never met before, or they have no idea what they do at the ballot box, and having to actually learn about how their system works in their city, their state, and their country.
It makes it real, doesn't it, Zachary?
Right.
I'm curious, Zachary, do you think that if we opened voting to young people, that there would be more engagement, as you and Sam posit? What's your evidence for that?
Well, I don't know if I have the same facts that you guys have from your in-depth analyses, but I do think that at least from what I've seen, young people are very willing to call out the things that they find offensive and to stand up for the things that they find important. And I think COVID has just shown that to an even greater degree. To think of all the stories about young people helping in their community during the COVID pandemic. And I think also, at least from what I've seen, young people have in many ways been better about masking, at least at my school. And I think that young people have shown that they have this community spirit that I think is in many ways lacking in older generations. And maybe in many ways that's born of necessity, right?
Right.
Especially at a time like this.
Right. This would be Sam's point, that you've had to stick together as a group because of the challenges you've faced.
Right. And I also think that these crises, COVID, the environment, racism in our society, have made young people warier of the sort of political polarization and political dichotomy that we have in this country. And I think if we want to see a strong third party, it has to include young people in its coalition.
Sam, that's exactly the point I wanted to follow up on too. You make the point in your prior comment and in many of your wonderful writings that this younger generation is less partisan, more problem focused, up for grabs in a sense. What's the evidence of that?
Sure. So we've written a bunch on this, and the nice thing is that thanks to really ground moving polling changes, we're able to do a lot more surveys more affordably and actually ask folks, and over and over and over again, strong attachment to parties is less. We don't see young people identify being a Republican or a Democrat anywhere near the level of older folks. When we ask about, would you listen to the other side? Do you think you can work with people from diverse backgrounds with diverse views? Younger folks take that as a point of pride. It is a badge of honor to say we disagree on things, or I want to hear what someone else has to say. And as a result of this, over and over and over, the data just says, look, this group is not wedded to the Republicans. It's not wedded to the Democrats. This is not a situation from the 1960s or 70s where, there's a clear generational consciousness in one direction or the other, or an overwhelming generational consciousness in one direction or the other. But it's a group searching for solutions. So we write regularly that whichever party can stop being so narrow and can start being, more broad and reach out, they'll be able to hopefully harness the power of this group and create a new coalition. I'm certainly hoping we'll see that. And it's something that I've seen in my classroom, and I presume you've probably seen a similar thing at UT Austin, and it's something I see when in my travels before COVID, when I'd be lucky enough to visit universities and colleges around the country. A number of years ago, I would be exasperated after teaching, exhausted. It would be very contentious. There would be a number of students in the class that were extreme in one way or the other. And it would be a very intense lecture or a very intense seminar. And you sit there and you go, boy, I have to really get through this. And, what questions are they going to ask? And they're not questions that because they're curious, they're questions to prove a point or make some particular ideological, or prove some, particular ideological view or value. And a number of years ago, it changed. I had students who certainly were passionate about certain things, but they were never that extreme. Teaching became a joy again because the students came in, they read, they didn't argue with me over, is this book left or right, or in terms of who wrote it. They said, okay, this person is leftist or this person is on the right. Here's what they say. Here's the evidence. Here's the facts. And I'm very, very optimistic about that. The students are curious in a way they hadn't been a few years ago. This is a generation that can get us there.
Yeah, I have certainly had exactly that same experience, and I have found, just as you have over the last 5 to 7 years, students have become much more interested in understanding these deeper problems rather than picking sides. And in fact, if anything, they think picking sides is exactly the problem. So I think you're spot on with that. Zachary, what would this look like in practice? We'll talk in a second about how one could do this legally, but before we talk about that, would if 16 and 17-year-olds were given the right to vote, what would be the best way to make that happen? What would it look like in our society?
That's a good question. I think that encouraging voter participation among young people would definitely have to be a priority. I don't think that, even though our generation is so politically engaged, I do think there is still a dissatisfaction with a lot of the systems of government and traditional politics. So I do think there would have to be a lot of voter engagement. I mean, if you're 16 years old, you're old enough in most states to get a driver's license. You're old enough to get a job. You're certainly old enough to have a child under the law. And I think that we should make voting a part of the everyday interactions that we have with government. Voter registration should be easy. And I think that should apply not just to young people, but across the board. And I just want to reiterate this point that legally, young people, 16 and 17 in particular, are already in many ways full members of our society. It's simply when it comes to voting, really, that they don't get treated in civil society as equals. And I think that part of the problem is that young people, especially at the moment, are having to take on such responsibility, and they're not being given a voice in the decisions that really affect them.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you and I have spent some time talking about this, right? That 16 and 17-year-olds like yourself, as you say, you can drive. As a 17-year-old, you can join the military. You're certainly responsible for doing all the things you need to do to get into university at your age. As you say, you could raise a child, but you are not allowed to drink, and you're not allowed to vote. Why do you think we draw these distinctions? Why in a state like Texas can you, in a sense, be forced to give birth if you are pregnant at that age, but yet not be allowed to vote?
I think part of it is we sort of make this distinction between things that are sort of privileges and responsibilities. We don't treat voting like a responsibility, like an everyday part of being a member of a civil society. We treat it as this sort of privilege that is only given to those with enough experience of a certain kind, with enough sort of opinions that run in the right line. And so I think that part of the problem is we don't see voting as this everyday thing. It's something that unfortunately a not very large amount of our society participates in. And so I think we need to sort of change how we think about voting if we want to stop finding ourselves in a situation where we're limiting the voting rights of people who are already treated in almost every respect as full members of society.
So sort of like how going to high school became the norm in the 20th century, being a political participant, voting should become part of the norm as well. So, Sam, we argue in the article that the three of us wrote that this is actually something that could be done even without agreement in Congress, even without reforming the filibuster, as is necessary for other reasons. One could do this at the state level, that states, since they have the right to determine voting laws, the 26th Amendment simply requires them to allow those 18 and above to vote, or not to restrict voting because of the age if you're 18 or older. The states could start down this path. Do you think that's realistic?
Probably not, unfortunately. I think you'll see a few cases where it'll be tried, you'll see it attempted, and it'll get a little weird. Here in New York City, they've increased the voter rolls by allowing non-citizens to vote. Interesting. A whole different set of legal questions. But I think this is going to require a state with a large younger population to really step up and do it. The reason I say probably not is not because it shouldn't happen, but because you have to find a state where there's a large enough, population of folks who are open to doing it. Texas is actually a good candidate for that. There are enough college and university students scattered throughout the state that if they work hard on this, Texas might do it. But obviously, with Governor Abbott and a whole set of other problems, Texas is a challenge. But it's a place like Wisconsin that might be open to do it. A large student population there, big presence in Madison. Maybe there's a way they could lobby and do it. The older generations, and this goes back to Zachary's point. Again, it's all about power. They don't want to necessarily hand it over. voter turnout is generally low in this country. It was pretty high in 2020, a little over 50%, but generally off-year elections, which really, really matter because they set up so much state and local government and so much institutional norms. You're looking at percentages that are often under 20 or 30%. The people who have that control don't want to have it changed. But I do think, again, that if you're in a state with a large student population who realizes how important this is, and I mean college student population over 18 whose vote still matters, they can be a mouthpiece, again, for the younger cohorts. In a place like Wisconsin, you might see it happen.
Yeah. And it's relevant, just following your excellent points, to think about how states have been the leading edge of voter change throughout our history. It is, of course, many of the states that were well ahead of the 19th Amendment, giving women finally the right to vote in 1920. Many Western states, for example, had women's suffrage long before the federal government did. The states got well ahead of that. Felony enfranchisement, right? It's not guaranteed at the federal level, but even a state like Florida recently passed a referendum. The state legislature in Florida is trying to prevent it from going into effect, but the state of Florida passed a referendum overwhelmingly, in fact, because of grassroots activism, just as you described, Sam, basically re-enfranchising or trying to re-enfranchise former felons in the state who had been denied the right to vote. So what you're describing is actually a historical, tried and true model of grassroots activism in the states, perhaps in a smaller state starting, a state with a lot of young people going out and pushing the state through referendum and through regular voting where they can to actually enfranchise younger voters. And states have every authority to do that.
And I don't want to sound pessimistic or negative because it's a point I think we make in the piece that's saying, it's not likely. And that's the thing. There are going to be states where it's going to be challenging. But I think you raised the point that, the states, federalism really matters. A lot of people have rediscovered federalism during COVID, where they see how different states react to these things and how powerful states really are in shaping policy that's hugely impactful for safety and day-to-day life. So I think, folks are very aware of how powerful states can be now in a way they weren't 10 years ago and 20 years ago. But a state, like, again, Massachusetts, you might see it. Massachusetts has a very large number of students, tends to be liberal, may be very open to this. So you may also see a state like that do it. Texas may have some of the conditions, but a lot of conditions won't be met. New York may have some trouble doing it. But again, there are going to be some states that and I agree, that may be smaller where you're going to see this happen.
Absolutely. So I think that the final question I wanted to ask and the final topic I think we wanted to explore, and it's one you already touched on, Sam, is what effect would this have? Not just for the younger voters. Zachary has talked very eloquently about how this would provide a sense of civic responsibility and a sense of civic spirit among younger voters, but for society as a whole. Why, Sam, are you convinced, as you said before, that bringing in 16 and 17-year-old voters might save our democracy, to put a strong point on it?
But it's actually very, very much true. We are stuck. The fact is that you have a large number of Americans in the middle, confused, and they want to engage, but they hate their choices. Or if they don't want to, they may just choose to sit this out because it's so polarizing and so disgusting. So the parties really are just sort of moving more and more to the extreme. And the question, again, to me is, how do you shake that up? Well, if there is a new group of voters in the millions that's available and engaged, and these folks are engaged, and we see that they're engaged. We see how they unified around taking President Trump down. What's also important to note is that this same group which took down President Trump does not like President Biden. A lot of people misunderstand that. They think that, it's a love for Biden. No, it was a disdain for Trump, but they still very much dislike Biden. So the question is, where can they put, their efforts? One of the things about parties is they want to win. And they want to govern. That's one of the first laws of political science, that you have to win elections or you're nothing. At some point, one of these parties will be smart enough to pivot. So to me, it's in many respects creating a market force that can actually shake up the system a little bit. And it may be slow on a national level, but on a local level, especially in certain cities and certain areas with large younger populations, this really may break some gridlock. And to me, I'm excited about it because I do think if we don't do something soon, we are really heading down a path to potential civil war. and just complete ineffective government. And this is not a view I took 10 to 20 years ago.
Well, and just to build on those fantastic points, Sam, I think one could really see the effect this would have almost immediately on a number of congressional races. There are a number of gerrymandered districts that have large numbers of students in them who don't vote. But if they voted, it would change the complexion of those districts immediately, and that could have an enormous effect on who controls the House of Representatives, just as one example, right?
Exactly. And our population is not random. It's not scattered in a random way. It tends to cluster around certain cities. So it will have a real impact, just spatially.
Zachary, what impact do you think it would have on policy? Do you think it would actually, for example, bring more attention to climate issues, or at least mobilize more people around climate issues? That seems to be one topic that does unify a lot of younger voters. Also, issues of sensitivity to gender and different sexual choices. Do you think that would manifest in our policies?
I do think so. I think that would be an important aspect of this sort of sea change, if you will. But I also think that a key component here would hopefully also bring greater involvement and concern from politicians about things like education, right? And more local issues that actually affect young people on a very day-to-day basis. I think we forget how much of even national politics is about local constituencies. And I think with a sort of young voter base in a lot of districts, that could have a real impact on basic infrastructure and educational institutions.
So I think we've really covered so much of this topic here. I wanted to ask you the last question, Zachary. You got to open with a poem. And since you are the 17-year-old on this podcast, I think Sam and I both agree you should have the final word.
Please, absolutely.
As we're imagining this different world. And one of the points of our podcast is for listeners to recognize that democracy is about history and imagining, that we have to recognize that what we inherit in our society is not the limit of possibility. The history teaches us that every generation, as Franklin Roosevelt said, has to reinvent our democracy. And what we're talking about here is democracy reinvention. As women suffragists reinvented democracy, as civil rights activists reinvented democracy, as the movement to 18-year-old voting reinvented democracy, we're talking about reinventing it here around young people rather than those who dominate our system now. Zachary, do you see this as something that young people could get behind? Sam has made the point so well that it requires young people not only wanting this, but actually creating a movement. What do you think?
Yes, I actually really do think that this is something that young people could become very engaged in, namely because no matter your political color, when you look at the people in power as a young person, they don't reflect us. And I think that that's a very, we might underrate that as an important motivating factor. I mean, to think about all the huge global and local issues that affect young people on a day-to-day basis, especially now in 2022, and to think that we have so little say in those issues, and so little say in the issues that will affect us 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the line. And I think that's really powerful. And if anything, the last 2 years have shown us that our system is broken, and that we can't just sit idly by and wait for it to change to our needs.
So well said. Close us out, Zachary.
Thank you for listening to this episode of This is Democracy.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.